more effective nutrient management on organic farms. So today we're going to do a little bit of review, just in case there are a few people who are new to this. Looking at the list of names, I think maybe there are some that haven't been on all our webinars before, and but there are also many who have. So I'm going to try to strike a balance between covering what needs to be covered, but also not boring those who have been through this before. That said, much of this I think does bear repeating. It's important information that is important for all of us to remember, and sometimes frequent reminders are good for all of us. So the tools that we have developed here are basically to help us answer this question of when to add nutrients in organic farming systems, and also to shed a little bit of light on the question of how much. So for nitrogen, we've studied this a lot, and generally that 2 to 3 years of cropping between a green manure or a perennial forage is what we aim for. There's lots of variables though, and each farm will need to find its own kind of best rhythm, I guess we could say, of when to include legumes in its rotation. Phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, all the micronutrients, there's a lot less clarity for those nutrients on how to manage them, when to add them, at what point are you actually too low, and when do you need to top up? Lots of questions there. So through these tools, we're adding a little bit more of a precise view of what's happening with nutrients on organic farms to help us make those decisions in an effective way. I've shown this slide showing the nitrogen cycle a number of times, and not going to walk through all the different steps here, other than to point out that between soil testing, just regular normal soil testing, and the plant testing that we do with the green manure bioassay, and the nutrient budgets, we actually cover a fair chunk of the nutrient cycle. And of course, this is the nitrogen cycle, but it applies similarly to the other nutrients. And so all this information helps us gain a more complete picture of how nutrients are moving around through our cropping and livestock systems, and how we can manage that. Of course, all of this needs to be backed up with field observations. Often that can tell you, it's a way of ground truthing, I guess, what you're seeing in any of these test results and the numbers, and of interpreting what is going on, and also providing really relevant and applicable recommendations to the farmer. So this is really important to keep in mind. None of this is, prescription type of agriculture. They are all tools that we use along with our agronomic knowledge and our skills of observation to help make recommendations on how to manage what is really a very complex system involving soil and plants, and perhaps animals, and all. Please remember that as we learn about these tools and as you use them. Many of you, hopefully all of you, will have seen this picture, this diagram before, showing the timeline of how you are possibly working with farmer clients. So today we're focusing on the purple boxes, which describe the process for the nutrient budgeting tool. And so you'll see that down at the bottom, we're asking farmers to collect grain, hay, manure samples, that kind of thing, and send them in. You, as the agronomist, have hopefully been getting back some analysis from the labs on those samples, and if not, you will be soon, hopefully. And today we're going to talk about how to calculate the budget and interpret the results, which will help you then in the final steps to discuss the budget results with the farmer, along with those bioassay results, and any other management options that are of concern for the farmers. So nutrient budgeting, we're going to go through a very, very brief overview of the theory, talk a little bit about the required information and how to collect it. This is a review for many of you. Then talk about how we're going to compile that information and the results using the Excel spreadsheet tool. And today we're really going to focus on our new approach to estimating nitrogen fixation. That's going to be where we spend the bulk of our time today. So that will be new for all of you. And we will talk a little bit about the other steps in the process of using the Excel tool. But those are largely unchanged from last year. And so anyone who is doing this for the first time, if this is your first webinar, I believe the webinar from last year on this is still available. And so if you want more details on some of the other steps of the process, you could refer back to that older webinar for some of that information. And then we'll also talk a bit about some interpreting of results and making recommendations. Just a quick overview of the documents that you should have received and that we'll be referring to a little bit today. And there's an instructions document. There's a kind of a quick start guide, which has just sort of a brief summary of the instructions if you just need a little reminder of how to do something without going into all the details. There is a questionnaire that you can either send to farmers. I've had some farmers who are happy to fill those kinds of things out themselves using Excel, or printing it out and filling it out on paper and faxing it back or whatever. Or you can use it as a guide for a phone conversation or in-person conversation with farmers to collect the information you need. And then we have a blank version of the workbook, the actual Excel spreadsheet that calculates the budgets, as well as one that's filled out with an example so that you can see some of the possibilities for how to use that. And I've tried to make the example quite diverse so that you can see how you would do various of situations, you know. For example, say part of a field was harvested as grain and the other part was cut for green feed, or you grazed a green manure. All those kinds of things are built into that example. So feel free to refer to that anytime and play around with that file and try things out. I think these tools get more useful as we become more familiar with them. So very briefly, nutrient budgeting is basically a way of measuring nutrient flows through a farm or farm system. So we're measuring the nutrients that are imported, exported, and then we can calculate the balance. And that allows us to identify and quantify trends over time, whether we're actually depleting nutrients or maybe accumulating excess nutrients. So the two main types of budgets that are kind of out there are a whole farm budget, where you look at a whole farm over 1 year, which provides one certain type of information, and that's actually what I did in a research project that a couple of you participated in or know about. And the other type that we're going to be talking about today, which is more useful as an agronomic planning tool, an assessment tool, is a rotation budget, where you take an in-depth look at one particular field at a time and look at it over a whole crop rotation on that field. So you will be taking information from several years and creating a rotation budget based on that. That allows you to actually see what's come onto that field over time, what has gone out, and see what the status of that field is. So that's really what we're focusing on today. I want to just start out by mentioning a few things that a nutrient budget doesn't do, so that we don't have kind of overly optimistic expectations, I guess, out of what we can't get out of what we could get out of it. So technically what we're doing is called a partial nutrient budget, in that it doesn't include every single thing. It doesn't include environmental gains or losses, and so we know that there's nitrogen, for example, being deposited from the atmosphere. There's nutrients being released from soil parent material. all the time. We have leaching, erosion, volatilization, all kinds of things going on. We know they're happening. They're hard to measure, and so we don't include those. But we need to remember always when we look at the numbers that we're getting, that there are always those things that we haven't quantified and that can perhaps explain some discrepancies between what the numbers are telling us and what the field actually looks like. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind. This nutrient budget also does not actually measure soil nutrient reserves, or you can think of them as the assets. It just measures the change. And so that's something to remember when looking at the end when you have excess, surpluses or deficits. How to interpret those will depend on what the starting point or of soil nutrients that you have. You also need to remember that the nutrient balance that we get at the end is not necessarily, well, actually it isn't probably ever a good indicator of productivity of the system. You can have a system that's a zero balance that is very unproductive. For example, in an extreme example is a fallow system where you put nothing in and you've taken nothing out, and yet clearly that is not a situation where you've optimized the nutrient management, and yet you might have a zero balance. Similarly, you might have a very productive system that's in balance. So that the actual balance that you get at the end is useful for some things, but not as an indicator of productivity. However, all that data that you use to calculate the balance is really useful for kind of assessing how well the system is used. So basically, we want to, when calculating a budget, we calculate all the nutrient imports, and those include seed, which is a small amount, but we know it, so it's easy to include. Any nitrogen fixation from legumes, any soil amendments like manure or compost or anything else, as well as things like if you've, say, brought in some forages for bale grazing, those are important to include. Our nutrient exports include, of course, any grain removed, as well as straw or hay removed. And when you have grazing livestock, it's important to consider the forage that they have removed. So all those things get sort of run through a bunch of fairly simple mathematical equations. It's mostly, multiplying, adding, and subtracting, and at the end we get some numbers that indicate whether we have a surplus or a deficit of each of the nutrients. And we're dealing with the four major macronutrients here, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. So to calculate the budget, we don't want this to be kind of a black box where you just stick in numbers and don't understand how the results are obtained. So very simply, the math behind calculating the budget is simply knowing the quantities of each material that comes onto or off of that field, and the nutrient concentration of that item. When we multiply those two factors, we get the nutrient content of whatever that material was in pounds. We're working in imperial units here for the sake of keeping things kind of simple. So the quantity, that is what we will discover by talking to the farmer and having them go through their records and providing you with all of their information. Nutrient concentration we obtain by preferably sending samples into a lab for analysis. We've seen that there can be a lot of variability in the nutrient concentrations of products, and so it is best to analyze products whenever we can. Lacking those, we can also refer to published book values to get those nutrient concentrations. Okay, so just very briefly, this is what the questionnaire for farmers looks like. There's been a little change in it with where the red box is about the information that we need about their legumes to be able to estimate the nitrogen fixation appropriately. So there you see we need to know what the legume species or mix is, an estimate of the biomass or yield per acre, and that applies to green manures or forages that were underseeded and are just kind of going in the fall a little bit, as well as hay and pasture. I need to know how many acres I was on, and importantly, we need to know the percent legume in a mixture, and we will sometimes need to know what the use of that that product was. That's what the last column is there, where it says manure, hay, grazed, or regrowth, just to help with understanding what role that legume played in the system. Pulse crops, the nitrogen fixation is calculated from the crop yield, so that will come out in down below where farmers are reporting the materials removed from the field, and they'll let you know what the yield of any peas, soybeans, those other pulse crops as well. That to calculate the next. I want to just remind you here that we need this information over a whole rotation. Ideally, you would perhaps work with a farmer over enough years to collect this actual information for every year. In the meantime, though, when you're just starting out, you need to actually ask the farmer to go back over the years through their records to get that information over a whole rotation so that you can calculate what has happened over that on that field over time. And that we know organic farmers do generally have pretty good records on their yields and that kind of thing. They may need to do some guesstimating about things like green manure biomass, and so you can do things like if you saw a green manure crop on their farm this year, you could say, okay, well, was last year's green manure better or worse than this one? How much better? 20% better, double, half as good, whatever. And realizing that it's not a perfect number, but it does give you at least something to work with. Okay, the nutrient concentrations. As I mentioned, we hope to get lab analysis of as many farm products as possible, and that includes grain, hay, manure if it was applied. That's a big one because manure application can have a really big impact on a nutrient budget. And so knowing the actual nutrient concentration of that manure is really helpful to getting a good estimate of what the nutrient import was. It's important to remember that some of those numbers may not be reported to you in percentage, but we need to convert all of them to percentages, because that's what we're working with. You may need to do a little bit of math. Say if something is reported in say grams per kilogram, or sometimes manure is reported in pounds per ton or something like that. Also need to remember that we're talking about elemental phosphorus and potassium here, not P2O5 and K2O, which is how some reports come back. So again, a little bit of math may be needed on your part, and there's the equations are readily available. They're also in the instructions for how to convert between those types of. We also need to make sure that we're using the correct moisture content for these nutrient concentration coefficients. Usually when you get an analysis back from the lab, it will come based on a dry matter, as in a 0% moisture content. But when you're getting your quantities from your farmer, they are probably reporting on a standard moisture content, and their bushels or tons per acre or whatever. And so there is in the Excel spreadsheet, there's a tab called Farm Coefficients that will allow you to kind of enter them on whatever moisture content you have them, and then convert to the other one as long as you know the moisture content. And if you don't know the exact moisture content, there's some assumptions we can make about kind of standard grain moisture content. If you need more information on that, please refer to the instructions or talk to one of us separately. If you really don't have an analyzed value for a product, there are standard values in that Excel sheet. There's a tab called Standard Coefficients that you can refer to. But that is really a last resort for if you have no analysis done. I'll also point out that when you're having products analyzed, you, perhaps, as an example, perhaps this field was a green manure that you're doing this for this year. It was a green manure this year, and so obviously you don't have any grain to analyze from that field from this year. You would collect a sample of the other crops that were in the rotation. Let's say it was wheat last year. Get a sample of the wheat from another field on that same farm that was hopefully under similar management, and use that product to as a proxy for what happened on the field that you're actually looking at. So that's why we're getting grain or hay samples from all around the farm, but then using them to create a budget for one particular field. Over time, hopefully you could accumulate analyzed values for particular fields over a series of years. But starting out, we have to do the best we can, and an analysis from a product on the same farm and a different field is still probably better than just using a standard published value. Okay, let's move on. Actually, let's just pause there for any questions. We'll just take a moment. I haven't seen really anything come up in the chat box so far related to the content. So I'll wait for just half a minute or so and see if any questions pop up, and if not, we'll move along. And again, if you think of something afterwards, feel free to type it in, and we'll address it later. Yeah, I'm not seeing anyone typing even, so I think we'll go on and assume that you're all understanding. Okay, we're going to talk a bit about how to construct the budget now. Just a quick overview of the whole process is that you're going to use the Excel spreadsheet first to calculate nitrogen fixation estimates. Talk about that in a moment. You are going to enter the quantities that you've collected from the farmer and use the spreadsheet to convert everything to pounds, even if they report it in bushels or tons or whatever. You will then be able to enter the coefficients that you've either gotten from your lab analysis or getting from the standard values. And then there's a bunch of automatic calculations that happen once you've entered all that. So you will have year by year totals and the balance, the total that came in and that went out, and what the balance was for each year of the rotation, as well as for the whole rotation, and an average per year of the total and the balance. And all of these are calculated both on a whole field basis and a per acre basis. And the per acre basis is particularly useful in being able to compare to other fields. Okay, so we're going to dive into the nitrogen fixation now, and I'm actually going to walk you through some of the science behind this, because like I said earlier, we don't want this to be just sort of a black box where you don't understand how we get these numbers. And so we're going to look at the approach that we're actually using. And this is a new approach. We have struggled over time over how to best estimate nitrogen fixation and have used a variety of approaches. And then I came across this one last year, which comes from an article that was published out of Europe, France, and but it collects data from temperate farming systems all over the world and looks at, it's hundreds of data points that they've used to look at this relationship between the nitrogen that's actually fixed by a legume and some other easy to measure things that could be used to estimate it. actually measuring nitrogen fixation is possible, but it's complicated and expensive, so we're not doing that on farms. So we need something that's easy to measure to be able to estimate nitrogen. And I want to emphasize that even with this we think it's an improved approach, it's still an estimate of nitrogen fixation because there are a lot of variables. So we're hoping to at least get into the ballpark. So on the left, you see these two colorful graphs here. The one on the left is the relationship between the legume shoot dry matter, so that's the above ground dry biomass of the legume crop, and the amount of nitrogen that is actually fixed from the atmosphere, so not taking up from the soil, in that above ground biomass. That's on the y-axis, the vertical axis. So as you can see, and the different colors are different crops. So they've got alfalfa, clover, faba bean, lentil, and pea. So you can see they did sort of plot a regression line. There's that diagonal line going across the plot. But there are values, there's data points all over the place. It's a fairly loose relationship, I will say, between the legume biomass and how much nitrogen. In the graph on the right, however, they included a little bit more information and plotted what they call shoot nitrogen yield, which is simply the legume dry biomass multiplied by its nitrogen concentration. So we're already doing that, right? We have those numbers. We have the nitrogen concentration from our green manure bioassay tests or hay tests or whatever, and we have a measurement of legume biomass. So it's very easy for us to calculate this shoot nitrogen yield. And as you can see, the relationship between shoot nitrogen yield and the actual shoot nitrogen fixed is a lot closer. The data points fall quite neatly around that diagonal line showing the relationship between the two. So that equation, or that regression line, is what we're using as the basis for our calculation. These authors of this paper actually broke it down a little further too into looking at, is there a difference between the grain crops, like grain type crops like peas, lentils, faba beans, and forage legumes in their nitrogen fixation. And so you can see that they did find a little bit of a difference when they plotted those separately. The purple dots, symbols, and the line is for forage legumes, and the green is for grain legumes. So you can see for the same amount of nitrogen contained in the above ground biomass, forages actually had a little bit, for forages, a little bit more of that was actually nitrogen fixed from the atmosphere as opposed to taken from the soil. So they have quantified these relationships with some equations. For forage crops, the above ground nitrogen fixed is basically the shoot N yield, which is, again, that legume dry matter times the nitrogen concentration, multiplied by 0.79. And then there's a small kind of adjustment factor, that y-intercept, where, that line doesn't quite come from where the zeros meet on the two axes, but it's a fairly small adjustment. For the grain legumes, it's a similar equation but slightly different. Again, we're taking that shoot nitrogen yield, so the above ground nitrogen content, multiplying it by 0.7, and again, there's a small adjustment factor. We all know, however, that there's stuff happening below ground, and so these authors also included a factor for the below ground component. And they based this on an extensive review of the literature and found that for forage legumes, can actually multiply this whole equation by 1.7 to get an estimate of the total nitrogen fixation. For grain legumes, such as peas, fava beans, etc., you can multiply the above ground nitrogen fixation by 1.3, a total, including all the root system and the rhizo deposition and all that. I'm going to pause there just for a moment to see if there are any questions, because this is sort of fundamental to understanding how the fixation estimate works. In just a moment, I'll get into how we're actually going to use it. We're going to simplify it just a little bit for our own use. Just want to make sure everyone understands the theory behind this before we move on. Okay, we're not seeing any questions pop up yet, so please, if you do think of some later, again, feel free to let us know, type them in. So let's take a look at then how we will actually use this in our spreadsheet. I've simplified the equation just a little bit and basically have combined that the equation for the above ground fixation with that multiplier with that factor for the above ground and below ground components into a single multiplier, and have gotten rid of those little adjustments, the y-intercepts that really make almost no difference to the end results that you get. So it ends up being a fairly simple equation. Just taking the shoot end yield, which again is just that legume dry matter times the nitrogen concentration, multiplying it by a multiplier. So for forage legumes, clovers, alfalfa, even including the annual clovers, you just multiply that by 1.3 to get an estimate of the end fixation. For grain legumes like peas, lentils, hairy vetch, fava beans, any of those green manures, you take that shoot end yield and multiply it by 0.9. So again, those numbers are basically just a simplification of the equations that we looked at on the previous slide. So the spreadsheet will actually do that for you, but if you are out and about and don't have the spreadsheet with you and want to just get do an estimate of how much nitrogen fixation a green manure or a hay crop could be providing, this is how you would do it using these equations. Let's look at how a couple of examples of the different factors in that equation and how they impact the total estimate of the nitrogen fixation. So there are those same equations at the top. The shoot end yield, again, is calculated by taking the total dry matter, the percent legume, because we need to emphasize that this is all based on legume dry matter, not the total dry matter. To get the legume dry matter, we multiply it by the nitrogen concentration, and that gives us the end yield. The nitrogen concentration is ideally we would have the nitrogen concentration of just the legume component of a green manure. We, so far in our green manure bioassay process or our hay testing and that kind of thing, are not getting that. We're getting a nitrogen concentration for the whole mix. However, in looking at my data over time, I've seen that the nitrogen concentration does not really seem to be related that closely to how much legume is actually in that mix, and so I think we can be fairly confident that using the nitrogen concentration from a whole mixture will at least get us into the right ballpark. So we have our nitrogen yield. That's our above ground nitrogen content of the legume crop. We multiply it by that multiplier, either 0.9 for grain legumes or 1.3 for forage legumes, and then that gives us an estimate of our nitrogen fixation. So here we have an example for a pea green manure. Total dry matter is 4,000 pounds per acre. We're saying it was 100% legume, so the legume dry matter is still 4,000. Its nitrogen concentration was 2.2%. We do that math, we get 88 pounds per acre of nitrogen actually contained in that above ground biomass. Multiply it by 0.9 to give us an estimate of 79 pounds per acre of nitrogen fixed. Pause there again. I see there was one question that has popped up. And if anyone else has a question, that would be a good time. Then we'll look at a few other examples of different types of green manures and hay crops. So Liz is asking, the grain legume number at 0.9 is reducing the dry matter times nitrogen concentration. Does that mean they are less efficient? It does seem that the annual legumes seem to be a little less efficient at taking nitrogen from the atmosphere compared to forage legumes. And there's been a lot of papers on that, and there are other factors there, and being in a mixture as opposed to a legume on its own will also impact that. But yes, it does seem that grain legumes are a little less efficient at fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere compared to forage legumes. Okay, let's continue to look at some other examples, so you can see how the different factors affect the outcome of this equation. So example number 2, here we have a pea oat green manure, an intercrop. Again, we're saying it's 4,000 pounds per acre, but only 60% legumes. That means our legume dry matter is a lot lower than with our first example. N concentration may be the same. We're saying it's 2.2 here. But as you can see, our N yield is lower, and as a result, our total nitrogen fixation is. In the past, we have been working with the total green manure biomass, and then using different coefficients for different amounts of different proportions of legume, which was always a little problematic, especially as you're close to one of those cutoffs, like when the cutoff was 50% or whatever, but your legume ends up being 49, or your green manure ends up being 49% legume or something like that. It was always a little bit problematic. So actually being able to use the actual legume percent to calculate the legume dry matter helps us get a lot more precise. Okay, sweet clover, which is considered a forage legume. The forage legumes, that multiplier is a lot higher because they do, even the annual forage legumes do tend to have a much more extensive root system than grain legumes do. So our example number 3, a sweet clover green manure. Let's say we have the same biomass, same nitrogen concentration, so we have that same nitrogen yield as we had with our pea, but our multiplier is 1.3 now. And so you can see the nitrogen fixation is 114 pounds per acre, which is considerably higher than you'd be getting out of a pea green manure of the same biomass. Example number 4, again, a sweet clover. Everything is identical to the previous example, except I want to show you the impact of nitrogen concentration of the green manure. So here we're saying that if the nitrogen concentration is 2.5% instead of 2.2, see the nitrogen yield is a lot higher, and correspondingly the nitrogen fixation. I included just an example of underseeded sweet clover, for example, that is growing into the fall. Perhaps it is just a small amount of biomass. Only 500 pounds per acre is not really much, and yet it does give you about 16 pounds per acre of nitrogen. The exact same system can be used for those underseeded sweet clovers, any kind of forages. Okay, hay crops are, the nitrogen fixation is calculated in exactly the same way, except that we need to account for multiple cuts and the regrowth of hay that's not actually measured in, when you just ask farmers about hay yield. And that caused some really confusing numbers in some of our past nitrogen nutrient budgets, where it looked like a good hay crop was actually resulting in a nitrogen deficit in a particular year because of using different coefficients for the nitrogen fixation and for the hay export and not accounting for the regrowth. So this system corrects that, but it's just important to realize that for a hay crop, you need to actually do the calculation for all of the the phases of that hay crop in that particular year. So the example here, 6A, 6B, 6C, is for one alfalfa grass hay crop in one particular year. So we have the first cut, we have the second cut, and we have the regrowth that was not harvested at the end of the year. So just as an example, I made up these numbers. We have, say, 4,000 pounds per acre of hay removed in the first cut, 2,000 in the second cut, and then, an estimate, say, from the farmer of how much regrowth was there. And that's the kind of thing that you can just get, if, by asking, for example, if you had cut that regrowth, how much hay do you think you could have got off of it, that kind of thing. Or it may be possible for you to actually assess it yourself, take a sample. Again, we need the percent legume in that mixture and need to acknowledge that that can vary over the year. It is best to try to get an estimate of that for each phase of that hay crop. Lacking that, hopefully you have a number for at least one of those that you can use. And if in doubt, best to kind of go with a lower estimate than a higher estimate to avoid overestimating. So again, exactly like before, we calculate the legume dry matter as a portion of the total. We have the nitrogen concentration. Again, here, perhaps you actually have analysis from those two separate cuts. If not, again, just use the analysis from whatever cut you do have or from a neighboring field, whatever, as your best estimate, and proceed with the calculation. So you can see, from the first cut, we're getting 52 pounds per acre, second cut, 44 pounds per acre, and that regrowth is providing 50 pounds per acre, and you simply add those up to get a total. Pause there again. I see we have one person typing a question. I'll let you kind of soak that in a little bit and think of whether you have any questions of clarification or how this would be applied in examples that aren't shown here. Okay, so the question is, what factors affect nitrogen concentration? Why is one clover a higher percentage than another? There's lots of factors. One of them is simply the age of the stand. So a younger, lusher stand will generally have a higher nitrogen concentration than an older, kind of woodier stand. That is probably one of the more important ones for our purposes here. There's lots of other things, the mix of legume and non-legume can affect that within a single, say, with all other things being equal. However, I've seen there's not really a very close relationship. The other factors seem to be more important. Well, there's probably nitrogen fixation experts on our call that could tell us more. But, yeah, really it's probably the age of the stand that makes the most difference. So the fertility of the soil in terms of other nutrients can make a difference as well. I'll mention that. So if, for example, if a field is extremely low in phosphorus, it can, or or low in sulfur, it can affect the legume's ability to fix nitrogen, and could then actually affect the nitrogen concentration of that legume. One more question being it's in at the moment. Okay, great question from James. How critical is nodule activity? In an older stand, there often seems to be less nodulation. It's a very good question. I should have stated earlier, and thanks to James for kind of tweaking my memory on this, is that all of these estimates of nitrogen fixation are based on the assumption that you have checked for nodulation and you have some kind of reasonable belief that that legume is actually nodulated and fixing nitrogen. So if you visited a green manure, you will dug up plants, check for nodules, and check that they're active. If they weren't, then you don't even need to bother doing all of this. You just say no nitrogen fixation in that particular legume crop. In an older hay stand, that is a great question, and there's been a little bit of research, I think, on how nitrogen fixation changes over time in hay stands. The research that I've seen is that typically within the first 3 years, maybe even up to 5 years, those alfalfa, or I think the research that I've seen has mostly been on alfalfa, so I'll limit myself to saying that. Those alfalfa plants are still actively fixing nitrogen. Some of that is recycled in the system as, you know, roots die and the plants take up some. But the research that I saw is that by the end of the year, every year, those alfalfa plants are actively fixing nitrogen because whatever free nitrogen is there has been mopped up. Older stands, I think as agronomists, you would have to use your judgment there. And perhaps, you know, if you don't see the nodulation there, if you know it's an old stand that has very little alfalfa in it, of course that'll be reflected in low legume biomass numbers. So I guess I would just say use your judgment. If it seems like this hay stand is no longer fixing effectively, then perhaps it is best to not calculate any nitrogen. That's great. We could probably spend a whole webinar just talking about nitrogen fixation dynamics over time with hay stands, but there's a lot of questions there. I hope that answered your question, James, and kind of shed a bit of light on that for the rest of you. Okay, let's move along and take a look at how to use this. We are almost at an hour now, and so I want to move through the rest of this fairly quickly. This is what the actual nitrogen fixation tab looks like, and just briefly, this gives you the opportunity to not have to bother calculating the dry biomass. You can enter the actual, say, the hay yield or a green manure sample that was just air dried, and put in the moisture content and calculate down to dry biomass. It also has places for you to enter the legume content of the mix, that portion, as well as the nitrogen concentration you've hopefully gotten from a test, and then gives you the nitrogen fixation. That's in the far right column there. Note that when you can choose the crop type from, there's a little drop-down list under crop type where you either choose grain legume or forage legume, and based on what you put in there, the spreadsheet will choose that multiplier automatically. So you don't actually have to tell it to multiply by 1.3 or 0.9. It does that based on what you put there. And then there's your nitrogen fixation in pounds per acre. You will then copy and paste those values into the budget tab in the space there, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Okay, looking at the bottom, I should have pointed out that the top section was for green manures and underseeded legumes. Also, if you are using an annual as a hay crop, or a green seed, or pasture, to use that green manure section because it allows you to use that grain legume calculator. The hay and pasture section assumes that all the legumes that you're using are forage legumes. And it basically does everything exactly the same, except that you don't need to say whether it was a grain legume or forage legume. Instead, you just indicate what the use was, whether it was hay or unharvested regrowth or pasture. That doesn't actually affect the calculations, but it's just good to their own. Oh. And then again, it comes up with a number at the end in the far right column. I want to point out that if you're having to make some assumptions about the nitrogen concentration of hay crops, it's important that you use the same number for the N concentration here when you're calculating nitrogen fixation, and then later when you're entering the exports from the field of the hay, make sure you use the same nitrogen concentration in both places. And that should make your numbers work out in a reasonable way. Okay, pulses and soybeans are actually, the nitrogen fixation is calculated differently. It's calculated based on yield, and that is actually the same as we were doing it before, except now it's on this nitrogen fixation tab in the spreadsheet. So again, you can put in your crop yield in pounds per acre, moisture content, so that it calculates down to a dry weight, and then choose which crop it is. Soybeans and dry beans have their own coefficients, and all other pulse crops use the same one. And the spreadsheet will choose the coefficient automatically based on the crop type that you put in there. And those coefficients are listed there, and they're in your spreadsheet as well. So that hasn't changed from last year. The actual calculation, I should say, hasn't changed. Just the way that you use it in the spreadsheet is just a little different. Okay, so let's get to the budget tab of the spreadsheet. This is where you're going to do all the calculations for the whole field. There's a section for every year of a rotation where you can put in, what's happened there, and it allows for any anomalies like not feeding the whole field, not harvesting the whole field, and please refer to last year's webinar if you need some more information on that. Just want to point out that here, you would put in that there's a different sweet clover green manure example, but you put in the acres of the field, some notes about what the numbers were, and then this number right here under N fixation is the one that you bring over from the nitrogen fixation tab, and then it calculates, the amount of nitrogen fixed on the whole field from that, and then also just lists again what was calculated per acre, and that goes into the budget calculations for the whole. Okay. So let's leave nitrogen fixation for now. If some other questions pop up in your mind, feel free to in. I want to very briefly go over the inputs, the other parts of the Excel spreadsheet. This is what it looks like for a simple wheat crop where, there's obviously no nitrogen fixation. Your inputs were only the wheat seed. You can see it's a small amount. Only, 3 pounds per acre of nitrogen, less than a pound of the other nutrients that we need. Then what came out is the wheat, and in this example, the wheat straw was also removed. So again, there you put in the quantities, convert everything into pounds. In this column here, it's column H, and put in the coefficients from either your analysis or the standard coefficients for each of those products, and you'll notice that they are very different for different types of products, and then it calculates the nutrient content on the whole field as well as a per acre basis. So that's a fairly simple example. Here's just a brief example. This is taken completely from the example file that you have, so please look at this on your own time, but I just want to point out that it does allow for putting in manure, and this one doesn't have anything done separately where one part of the field was treated separately, but that also is possible. And all the instructions for that are in your instructions document. So please explore all of that on your own. Okay, once you've completed all of those input sections for each year, you get the summary up at the top of the spreadsheet. And just to very briefly point out, we've got a summary for each year, and also summaries for the whole rotation. You'll notice that in each year, I'll look at per acre numbers. These numbers can vary wildly, and that is okay. That is how organic systems are managed, where we have big inputs. For example, in this year 2, we have the sweet clover green manure, large input of nitrogen. Then that is gradually used up. So example for, a lot of that is used up in the following wheat crop. Soybeans are near balance. Then we have another green manure, adding a bunch of nitrogen and then taking out a bunch. The hope is that over time, over the whole rotation, those more or less even out. And that's what you see up at the top here. That in total, the nitrogen ends up being a negative balance of 2.3 pounds per acre, which is, in terms of nitrogen balances, that's practically zero. That's about as close to being in balance as you can get. So again, I will allow you to kind of study those on your own time and get back to us with any questions that you have about how those summaries are calculated. I want to talk a little bit about what this all means and interpreting and making recommendations. So as I mentioned, the year-by-year balances can have huge variation from year to year. And basically, the higher the grain yield or hay yields that you have, the higher the deficit you'll have in that particular year. If you are removing straw and hay, that can contribute to a large potassium deficit in particular. And if you have a large green manure crop, you can have a very large nitrogen surplus in a particular year, but those are not cause for worry. Over time, though, those should more or less even out over the rotation. We'll talk about some exceptions in just a second. But ideally, your average yearly balance per acre would be close to zero. If it's a little off of zero, for example, we've kind of defined some values that we would call acceptable, as in not, not problematic. When nitrogen surpluses or deficits get to be greater than 20 in any in your average yearly balance, 20 pounds per acre per year, that might be an indication of a problem. Similarly, for potassium, around 20 is where a red flag could start coming up. For phosphorus and sulfur, if you're getting to be over 5 in that average yearly balance, there may be a problem. Not necessarily, but it's worth looking. So just very briefly, some likely causes of having deficits over your whole rotation is simply, high yield. If you have a nitrogen deficit, perhaps there are not enough legumes in rotation. something to consider talking to the farmer about. Phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur deficits usually show up when there's little or no nutrient replacement, which we often have on organic farms, especially near the beginning. And that's not necessarily a problem in the near term, but it's important to begin thinking about a long-term replacement plan for those nutrients. Likely causes of surpluses. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing. High rates of soil amendments is an obvious one that can create a surplus, especially if someone is kind of playing catch-up and trying to correct a past problem. And so, those surpluses may not actually be, the surpluses may actually be a sign that things are headed in the right direction after correcting for some past deficits. The other kind of tricky one is when you have low crop yields due to non-nutrient issues. So weeds, hail, drought, anything that reduce the nutrient export from a field can result in you having a surplus. Similarly, having a low crop yield or a low nutrient concentration in the product due to poor soil fertility, in particular, I would say low phosphorus or something like that, can result in a surplus in the calculation. Especially if, there's been a correction later in the rotation. So, the first years of the rotation, you still have low yields, low nutrient concentrations calculated in the budget, and then you have a big input later on. You might have a surplus that is not actually a sign that there's too many nutrients in the system or going into the system. It's a sign that too few nutrients were exported because of low yields. Okay, I'm just going to briefly address a question that's come from Jennifer. Is there any information on method of termination and how that would affect nitrogen availability? Example, worked in versus mowed versus rolled. And there is information out there, but I want to point out that this nutrient budget does not deal with nutrient availability at all. It's just a mass balance, how much is there. So that's the other thing to remember is some of that, these surpluses or deficits could be buffered by the soil organic matter. But even if you have a surplus of something, it's not like it's going to escape on you necessarily. It may get absorbed by soil organic matter. So nutrient availability is an entirely different topic that a nutrient budget does not address at all. Okay, just to be totally clear on that. Okay, interpreting these budgets, this is where your observations, your knowledge of the farm are really important in interpreting what is going on with the numbers. Numbers are only numbers, and they require your other knowledge to help interpret them. Even a near balanced budget doesn't necessarily mean that nutrient management is being optimized on that field. For example, like I mentioned before, if both imports and exports are low, you might have a balance, but that is obviously not optimal. If you have poor yields, low nutrient concentrations, again, that might make in certain combinations of factors that might make your budget actually look close to balanced or having a small deficit when really it's not an optimal situation. That's why you need to look at all the numbers that went into calculating that to determine the whole picture. You also need to consider whether nutrients are distributed poorly within a field, and that's particularly when you're dealing with say, grazing livestock, or if, say, manure was applied poorly, just kind of, bumps up in certain places. The numbers might make it look as if the whole field was experiencing that manure in the same way, but that may not be true on a whole field basis. And we also have to consider if those environmental losses or gains are high, which aren't calculated in the budget. So, if there's a lot of leaching potential, let's say, because of wet conditions and sandy soils, for example, that's something that you need to consider. Also want to think about some situations where actually surpluses or deficits are desirable. And like I mentioned before, if soil nutrients were low at the outset and a farmer is correcting for a long history of deficits, then it's actually desirable to operate at a surplus for some time. And you need that nutrient import and that investment of nutrients to actually increase the future exports. And conversely, if we were in a situation where soil nutrient levels were too high at the outset, then operating at a deficit is desirable. Okay, I was hoping, if there was time, but I don't think there is, that we could just kind of study this for a little bit and see if you could pick out what might be going on in this budget. But since we're already at a quarter after the hour, I'm going to just sort of map it out for you. So we have here a nitrogen surplus of 18.5 pounds per acre per year, which is getting close to that red flag mark of being 20. Also a phosphorus surplus, small potassium deficit, small sulfur deficit. So at first glance, it may seem like, hey, this guy is maybe applying way too much manure or something like that. You start digging in deeper. My first thought would be to look at, so you have this year where manure was applied, how much actually went on. The total imports in that system are not excessively high, so you can rule out excessive manure applications, I think, right there. Nitrogen fixation also is not excessively high in the green manures. It's decent, it's good, but it's not out of this world. Where I would then start to look is at the exports from the grain crops. And so when you have a wheat crop that's only exporting 24 pounds per acre of nitrogen, that's a pretty small wheat crop. And so then you need to start assessing why that wheat crop is not yielding well. And perhaps it's not a fertility issue at all. Perhaps it's weeds, or perhaps there was, it was hailed out or whatever. But these numbers can give you clues as to where to look down further in the budget for further information. Okay, just want to briefly look at how you can use this as a planning tool. You can essentially play with the numbers in this spreadsheet and make up scenarios to see how the budget works out. So this example scenario A rather, is the example from your spreadsheet. And you can see it's relatively in balance except for a bit of a potassium deficit. And if you trace it back, it's due to a lot of straw being removed in that. So you can then test some different scenarios and see how it works out. So for example, you keep everything the same in scenario B, except you don't remove the straw. What does that look like? And you see things are, the potassium is closer to being balanced. Let's say you don't apply any manure. Again, there everything is in deficit. So you change the type of manure that you're applying and find a manure that's high in potassium, like sheep manure is considered to be generally high in potassium. How does that affect the overall budget? Changing the manure rate, and then some combinations of, I want to mention scenario F. What happens if actually all the crop yields are increased? What would the budget look like? And then you can do more complex scenarios where you combine different things and see what it would be. A feature that I would love to have in here is if you could say, I want a close to balanced budget, and here are my crops that I want to grow. What should my rotation be to, or my manure application rate, or whatever, to actually achieve that balance? And that's a feature we don't have the ability to offer, but it would be cool. As it is, you can just play around with numbers, look at where the big inputs and imports rather and exports are, and tweak those. Look for options um, to manipulate those different nutrients to bring the whole system down. Okay, that is all I have to offer. I encourage you to, if you haven't already, to be out collecting your own data and working with this, because often it's in actually working with it that some questions can arise. And if you do have questions about the actual operation of the spreadsheet and the theory behind it, please feel free to get in touch with me anytime. If you are part of the nutrient management program and have questions about the logistics of that program, then Iris is the person to connect with about those. So maybe we can take any questions that have come up, and if there aren't any, then I think Iris has some final points that she wants to raise.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was another really great webinar. Let's just give it a couple more minutes to see if people do have questions. It doesn't look like there's any coming in right now, but let's just give it a couple of minutes, and then I will do some nutrient management updates for the agronomists who are in that program. And in the meantime, I will say that as I was following along, I found that really, really interesting, like looking at that data, looking at the correlation between the nitrogen fixation and the shoot nitrogen. I thought that was really interesting, and it brings another interesting layer into everything, and another layer of understanding. So it's neat. It's been really neat to watch this tool evolve over the last couple of years.
Great, that's good to hear, Iris. Thanks.
Okay, so I will say it looks like there aren't any questions coming in, and as Joanne said, as you start getting questions, as you start working with the tools, you can feel free to ask us those questions. So I will start with making just a few announcements for the agronomists who are in the nutrient management program. For those of you who are not in the program, feel free to stick around and listen to what we are chatting about. But otherwise, thank you for joining us, and have a great day. We will send out a recording of this webinar. The webinar was recorded, so we'll be able to send that out. So for those of you who are agronomists in the nutrient management program, all I really wanted to do is just to kind of check in and see if there are any questions, but also to let you know to check in about timelines. So currently, what's happening is that the farmers should be sending in their harvest samples from harvest. So this would either be their grain, their manure, or their hay in some cases. We sent out the packages to all the farmers back in August and September, so all the farmers should have received the package. If you haven't already yet, please get in touch with your farmer and have the conversation with them about what they should be sampling. They did get some direction and instructions with the package that we sent them, but of course it's always best if you are able to just have a quick discussion with them to decide what the most optimal sampling would be. You know, which field would be the most interesting field for them to sample, which grain would be the best to look at, or the hay or the manure, just to because you've been working with them throughout the summer and you kind of know what kind of questions they have about their farm. We have started receiving some of that data, so we know that some farmers have already started sending it in. If you are missing any data from the summer, either plant or soil or harvest data, and you think that you should have gotten it by now, please get in touch with myself or with Greg, and we can make sure that you get that information from A&L Labs. And so at this stage, for those of you who do have most of your data, what you can start doing is really start working with these numbers and start putting the numbers into the rotation budget the way that Joanne showed us today in the webinar, and start crunching some of those numbers. This will give you an opportunity to get familiar with it, and also to ask Joanne any questions if you have any questions about the process. Because once you're done that whole analysis, the next and final step will be to call the farmer that you've been working with and to have a conversation with them where you talk about some management options. And this is the part where the co-design portion of the program comes in, where you sit down or have a phone call with a farmer and you talk about what your findings are, but you also learn from the farmer a little bit more about what they're looking for and what kind of management they're interested in doing. So what we'll do to help support you through that process is we're going to have one more phone call, and that will be with you, the agronomist, and Joanne and myself. We're planning to do it for December 1st. So on December 1st, we'll be able to ask Joanne questions again and talk a little bit more about what that co-design conversation could look like, but also cover any questions that you may have that would have arisen in the last few weeks from working with your data. So I would encourage you to take the next few weeks, work with the rotation budget, work with your numbers, fill in any information from your farmer that you might still need to be able to work with that rotation budget, and then on December 1st, you can bring that and all your questions, and we can have a conversation about it. For this year, the final deadline to have everything submitted to your farmer and to the Prairie Organic Green Initiative, it will be January 19th, which I believe is a Friday. So that's when we would like to have all the information over to us and over to the farmer. And what we'll do in the next few weeks is send you just a summary of what the expectations are around that. And also, of course, what we'll need from you is your expense claims as well, so that we can pay you for the great work that you did over the summer. So we will be in touch over the next few weeks to make sure we can get all of that going. Are there any questions about anything that I just mentioned? I'll just give it just about a minute or so to see if there are any questions. Okay, well, you know, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so hopefully that means that things are fairly clear for everyone. So I will, I guess we can wrap this webinar up. Thank you again to Joanne. Thanks for such another really great webinar. It's very informative, and it's really great to see the new information that's been incorporated into it. And thank you to everyone who took the time to participate this morning. It's been really great to see really great participation over the last couple of years with the organic agronomy training as well as the nutrient management program. So, so yeah, I'll wish you all a great day and a great weekend, and we will all be in touch again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you all.
Leaving the meeting.
Joanne Thiessen-Martins.
Leaving the meeting.
Iris.
Leaving the meeting.